938 Live. This is Talkback.
Are Singaporeans just too self-absorbed, too inward-looking? Are we preoccupied with domestic issues, so preoccupied that we don't have a worldview of what could affect us in the long term as a nation? Call us on 669-11938. Talk to us also on Facebook, official 938 Live. Do you see it as worth it to get to know what's happening in other nations? And of course, then seeing our own domestic issues in perspective with what's happening in other nations, in relation to what's happening with other nations. Call us on 669-11938. Now, in his address recently at the National University of Singapore Society's 60th anniversary celebration, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said that we're looking inwards, not paying enough attention to the world around us. The Prime Minister gave 3 reasons why it's important for Singaporeans to have a broader view. Here are some of them. Firstly, world issues set our own domestic issues in perspective. Now, we might be preoccupied with matters concerning healthcare, financing, and aging population, immigration, income inequality, but many other countries are also facing these issues domestically. To get a sense of what we face, we have to know how others are tackling their problems, learn from their experiences as well. Then only will we be able to put our issues in perspective, perhaps make a more sound judgment, then decide on the course of action, if at all one is needed. And it will also be useful for us to understand how well we're doing and how we can do better. Do you agree with this? Now, the Prime Minister said that the pillar of Singapore's success is that we have always been open, connected and outward looking. We've got a vested interest in watching, studying carefully and knowing global trends. And that is why our country's leaders seek our views on international matters.
Now, PM Lee also reminded Singaporeans that major changes are taking place in the Asian landscape, and this is going to have a big impact on us. And unless we understand what's happening around us and we have to grasp these impact, Singapore is not going to be able to anticipate and respond appropriately to these world events. Now, with a new president in Indonesia later this month, an Indian Prime Minister with a strong mandate, and a rapidly innovative China, we need to take advantage of these trends. Now, why have we become too inward-looking rather than trying to learn lessons from what is happening on the global stage? How can we encourage people to be more outward-looking rather than focusing on just day-to-day domestic issues? And will we Singaporeans be adaptable and flexible enough to respond appropriately and ride the sea of change that surrounds us? Give us a call on 669-11938. Now, joining us today is Singapore Management University Associate Professor of Law, Eugene Tan. Eugene, why do you think the Prime Minister felt that it was timely to speak about being more outward-looking in our perspective?
Good morning, Andre. Well, I think there's been a concern over the last couple of years, where the government has been focusing very much on key domestic issues, issues that were hot-button issues in the May 2011 general election. I think there is a concern that Singaporeans may have become more inward-looking. So while domestic issues are important, given how our economy is structured, given our role in the geopolitical landscape, we cannot ignore what is happening around the world because they do impact upon us in many ways that we may not even be aware of. So I think for the Prime Minister, I think there was a concern that by being inward-looking, we may actually be losing sense of where we're heading and how much more we need to do or what is it that we can achieve. So I think that there is that concern, that we may have become frogs in a well, or that we may be on the road to becoming frogs in a well.
Based on your own observations, what do you think?
Well, I think, we probably have a two-track society, in that you do have a segment of the population which is very attuned to what's happening around the world. And so, this is a group that probably the Prime Minister is not so concerned with. But we also do have, Singaporeans who feel that, we have achieved, tremendous success and that we can now just, be very much inward-looking, just focus on domestic issues and perhaps not giving enough attention. So I think the Prime Minister was not saying that one is more important than the other. I think that the message is that we need to balance, both domestic issues as well as how international issues impact upon us. And in many ways, they will then enable us to to not only survive but thrive in the world that we are in today.
One might say that, of course, during an election, bread and butter issues tend to come up, and there might be a segment of the population that is still very concerned with those bread and butter issues because they find it harder to gain access to resources, for instance. So really, is what happens during an election an accurate gauge of what society is like?
I think certainly not, right? I mean, elections tend to throw up some, very much the hot button issues, But I think what has happened over the last 3 years is really, this tremendous effort, on the part of the government to get Singaporeans focused, very much on domestic issues. Partly, the need to get Singaporeans on board on the many different policies and initiatives that it is undertaking, the government's undertaking, but also to demonstrate to Singaporeans that the government is doing something about the issues that they care about. And I think the Prime Minister is now signaling that, we have put attention to it and we will continue putting attention to those domestic issues, but let's also let's not take our eye off the international, the ball that's in international court, because that, given that we are very much dependent on international trade, foreign investments, the flow of people and ideas, we need to keep an eye on those international issues as well. They are not necessarily international in the sense that they don't, in that they come from outside, but these are issues that do have impact upon Singapore. And also he gave examples of how what's happening in other countries, would intimately affect Singapore, if not now, certainly sooner, if not later.
Eugene, just give us an idea of how detrimental it might be if we continue to be insular and inward looking.
Well, I think one is that we become self-consumed. We then have no international reference point. So even if we talk about domestic issues, about the effort to help, the lower income Singaporeans, we need to see what is it, what has been the experience in other countries. What is it that's possible? What is it that may not have worked? But to then also contextualize it to the needs and demands of Singaporean society. So I think one is it certainly gives you that sense of perspective. Secondly, it probably shows you what is it that our competitors elsewhere are doing. Right. So you give the example of of WeChat, developer WeChat in China, and
right.
how a company like that made tremendous progress. So it is also to remind us, that competition is always there. And if I could just go to a third issue, if you look at immigration, I think the international perspective is important because it reminds us how there is that competition. For talent around the world, and much as we are concerned about the impact of immigration on Singapore, shutting the doors, to foreign manpower, whether it's at the menial labor end or the high end, it's not something that's going to work for Singapore. So so I think all in, it helps us to have a sense of where we are, who we are, and what is it that we need to do, and what is it that we can do.
And of course make constructive suggestions as well when it comes to consultation sessions with the government on policy issues. I think as citizens we could all stand to do a little bit of that, even when it comes to things as simple as, say, the public transport system. Stay with us on 938 Live. Tell us how you feel about this. Are we too inward looking, perhaps too self-absorbed as a society? To what extent do you think, or do you take the effort to ensure that you know what's happening in the rest of the world and try to set things in perspective, all the domestic issues in perspective based on the global climate? Give us a ring, 669-11938. We'll continue talking to you right after news and sports.
Are Singaporeans too inward-looking, or are we too preoccupied with domestic issues that we don't have a worldview of what could affect us in the long term as a country? These were comments made by Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong that we are looking inwards and not paying enough attention to the world around us. Now, do Singaporeans realize that having a global perspective and an understanding can actually help us better realize what we want for ourselves and for our families here at home. Now, joining us this morning is Singapore Management University Associate Professor of Law, Eugene Tan. Eugene, now we know that you have to run off very quickly, but can you tell us, how do we stay ahead then? How do Singaporeans stay ahead of the geopolitical and economic changes that are happening around us so that we don't fall behind?
That's a tough one. I think one is certainly, Singaporeans need to take, a greater interest in what's happening around the world. Particularly Asian developments. I think because that the economic gravity, central gravity is shifting towards Asia. If you ask how, then I would say, one is certainly to nurture that interest, and I think schools play a big part in trying to get students interested and knowing why it is important to know, what's happening around us. So certainly we can talk about the newspapers. We can talk about international publications, and I think that the National Library would be a good resource for that. Two is I think you need in many instances employers to try to point out how the international environment affects the business, affects Singaporeans. So there would be that reinforcement, so Singaporeans are able to see how developments in other parts of the world would impact upon us. But I think ultimately it's really Singaporeans, I think, are not predisposed, right? Towards seeing what's happening around them. I mean, we can take advantage of the fact that we are fairly well-traveled people, but I think it's really, much as we go abroad as tourists, it's also using the opportunity, to see what works in the countries that we're visiting, and to then compare that with Singapore and ask whether that experience or that policy would be equally applicable in Singapore.
Observing things is one thing, but actually analysing and coming to useful conclusions or coming up with constructive suggestions on policy issues is a different thing altogether. To what extent do you think perhaps political education needs to be upped in schools as well, so that we can be a more critical thinking society?
Well, I think that has always been on the table, right? How do we, ensure that we constantly that we remain nimble, as a people, as a society, and I think it's really, getting Singaporeans to develop, both, that outward-looking mindset, but also firmly grounded. In local realities, and I think that's important. So I think education, I wouldn't say political education, but really, in the different subjects, that the students learn in school, in the school trips that are being organized, trying to understand, how the international impacts upon us, So we can talk about the haze, for example.
Right.
So that's something that happens outside of Singapore. How does that affect Singapore? What is it we can do, or what is it that we cannot do? How can we as consumers, help to, punish, say, commercial companies, that engage in indiscriminate
do you
burning?
Think, Eugene, do you think with more forums and or more symposia, being held here in Singapore, or more discussions amongst ourselves, and even at school level, critical thinking is only introduced either in the IB, the International Baccalaureate, or in first year university? What if we brought critical thinking earlier into, pre-university or secondary school, for that matter?
Yeah, I mean that's certainly a suggestion that's worth considering. But I much as I feel that we can do with a standalone course. I think it's also important, to have critical thinking, imbued into every course,
aspect,
every subject, and certainly, Talkback could increasingly also focus on international or regional issues, and particularly connecting them with how they could impact upon local politics or local developments. So it need not necessarily be politics, but certainly, how international developments impact upon Singapore. So I think you need that whole of society effort, so that we will constantly remain ahead of the curve. We won't constantly be gazing at our belly button and think that, that's all that matters.
Thank you very much, Eugene. Eugene Tan, he is from the Singapore Management University and Associate Professor of Law there. Thanks for joining us this morning. As for you listening in right now, are you into navel gazing to the point that you even forgot to call in on 669-11938? Felicia Huang is talking to us on Facebook, though, right now.
That's right. Felicia says, we've debated, about different viewpoints on how to better and promote Singaporeans' well-being over the years, discussing things about congestion, housing, transportation, education. She says, now, how about looking at the changing economic and geopolitical environment? Can we make informed decisions against such an uncertain backdrop? She mentioned the Ebola outbreak, as well as events in the Middle East. And are we prepared for more mind-broadening discussions on what is happening around us, particularly in the region? Well, if you think we can certainly do with more discussion, you can also still talk to us on our Facebook page, Official 938 Live.
I have to say, I must laud some of our listeners who have called in over the last few months, over the last few years, in fact, to talk about various issues, bearing in mind the international examples as well, parallel international examples.
Correct.
For instance, when we talk about our transport system, several of our callers will call in and compare our system to, say, the system in Hong Kong, systems in Australia, systems in other developed nations.
Yes.
So at least there is that awareness, and comparisons are made often very, very accurately.
And even
and I know we have a thinking audience here at 938 Live.
Definitely. So we want to continue, of course, piquing your thoughts, and as I said, we'd like to hear from you. You can still talk to us on Facebook, Official 938 Live.